You're watching The Experience, Comic Culture and Sales, streaming live daily to Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, and Twitter.
What's up, the internet? How's it going? Producer Kyle. This is Hot Takes. Welcome in. So, we're going to start with some stuff. We're going to get into it deep. What's up, Kenneth Bird? Say hi when you get here. Tell me you're here so we can get into it. I want to hear your stories. I want to hear what you have to think. I'm going to open up the phone lines here in just a little bit. We're going to have a conversation. Hopefully, y'all can call me and we can talk. And hopefully, I stop hitting my microphone. Like, that's going to be a thing for me. So, when I was 13 years old or so, I was just getting to the age where my parents would let me go to concerts by myself, which I don't understand why they did. They knew the kind of music I was into, but whatever. So around the age of 13, my parents started letting me go to a concerts by myself. And I went to my first concert of this very cool local pop punk band. And I fell in love. I absolutely fell in love. It was the music that the voices in my head wanted to hear. And I was absolutely transformed by this genre of music that was pop punk. And you got to remember, this was 2000, 2001, right? This was kind of at the peak pop punk, right? So, of course, I bought their CD at this concert. And I listened to it and listened to it and listened to it and listened to it and memorized every beat and every riff and every word of every lyric. And about 8 months later, that band signed with this major record label. And they went out to LA to record their first major label record. And when it was released, I ran out and bought it. And I put it in the CD player and I start listening to it. And I was absolutely devastated. Absolutely torn up. And here's why. The CD, their first major label release, was basically the same CD I had just bought 8 months earlier. Except it sounded a lot better. The instruments were clearer. The mix was a lot stronger. The mastering was better. But the lyrics were different. The lyrics that this band that spoke to my soul had written had been blunted for this release. What's up, Canonus? They had changed them. And you could hear the influence of whatever corporation was running the label at the time. The lyrics were changed so they wouldn't offend people. This thing that was pure wasn't anymore, even though the thing that brought it about was great for the band. And I'm still I became friends with those guys a little while later. I'm still friends with those guys. And working for that company allowed them to buy great big houses and nice cars and set their families up and, pay for their kids' colleges and so much great stuff. But it changed the thing that I loved. So I want to talk to you tonight about how sometimes something that seems good might be bad, and how something that seems bad might be good. And you're already, I can already hear you, Canonus and Kenneth Bird and everybody else watching going, Kyle, you're talking in circles. This crap don't make any sense. I promise you it will. We all know the old cliche of if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And doing the right thing is never the wrong thing, even though I'm not sure that's an old cliche. I got it from Ted Lasso. I'm here to tell you that those things aren't always true. This started for me, this episode of Hot Takes started for me as an episode talking about WWE merging with UFC in a company called Endeavor. And it started off in this place and it went a different direction. because it started off with me thinking about how Endeavor owning WWE is a good thing. And then I got to thinking about how I've had these thoughts before. And I mean, I've had these thoughts several times. In 2008, I got my dream job, my first dream job. I've had several. I got hired basically to work as a promotions assistant at a rock and roll radio station. It was my job to go out and party. It was my job to go to these bars and go to these concerts and go to these ball games and stuff and to show everybody a good time. And I was really good at it. But the thing I knew was that my job was predicated on these bars and these venues coming through and wanting to hire us, wanting me to come out. And in 2008, a company called Bain Capital bought the company I was working for. And I went from having my dream job in March to being fired in September. I remember when Bain Capital bought us. I'm going to get to that, X. Thinking, oh, great. Well, this is a cash influx. This is going to save my job. This is going to make sure I've got job security. That wasn't what happened. I can almost never remember a case where 10 years after I heard a story or had a thought about, gee, it's good that these are, that this big company is coming in and bailing out this small company, or that there's people investing in this small company I love. I can almost never remember a case where 10 years later I felt the same way. There's one. When Marvel bought Star Wars. Not when Disney bought Marvel. Not when Disney took over Star Wars. When George Lucas sold the rights to publish Star Wars comics to Marvel, I remember thinking that was a good idea. And I still do. I love the Star Wars comics. Even if they're not doing necessarily right by the shows or the movies or any of that kind of stuff. I love the comics. Off the top of my head, I can't think of any other times where when the big boy bought the little guy, it worked out well. I can name a ton of times when it went the other way. So, as it turns out, this episode of Hot Takes is about how the grass is almost never greener on the other side. Welcome to Hot Takes. What's up, the internet? Sorry, I realized I had my What's Up, the internet hat on. I was like, I'll just point to it and see what happens. So we talked about kind of the premise of this show is how the grass isn't always greener. It started for me as this concept of WWE just came off of what they would tell you is one of the biggest WrestleManias ever. And they did a great job. It was, it was a nice venue, good staging. 2 nights in LA, 160,000 plus tickets sold over 2 nights. I will tell you, as a wrestling fan, Saturday night's WrestleMania was better than Sunday night's WrestleMania. And I will tell you that ROH Ring of Honor's Supercard of Honor on Friday night was better than both nights. But those are personal preference things, and I'm not going to get into that. But then the news breaks this morning The WWE has been sold. Candace, we could talk about that in a little bit if you want. I don't think the main event was actually that bad. I think the writing in the main event was bad, but we'll get into that in a second. WWE has been sold, except that it hasn't been sold. WWE has decided to merge with a company called Endeavor. Endeavor is the primary owner of UFC, and Endeavor will become the primary owner of the WWE, taking over 51% of its shares. So now we have one company that owns WWE and UFC. And on the face of it, that seems like a really good idea. WWE has been mired in controversy and problems because of Vince McMahon. Because Vince McMahon is an old man. Because Vince McMahon has made decisions that have been troubling for WWE. Because when Vince McMahon led creative, it was stagnant and it was awful. WWE has made huge strides since Vince McMahon stepped away a little while ago, and he's come back now, but they've made huge strides to get better. Triple H taking over creative, all of these things, and this is all to say that the way things happen matters, right? Candace says the time we'll get to that in just a second, Alfie. Candace says the time Vince was away was good. And we'll talk about the main event from last night. Alfie's here. They wouldn't try to make UFC fighters and wrestlers, would they? Brock Lesnar, Ronda Rousey. But then you've had guys go the other way too. I think what it had. I think let's talk about the WWE thing. We'll just get into that. So, Alfie, I think it has the potential to go both ways, right? I think it would be pretty easy with his background for someone like Seth Rollins to have a UFC fight. Especially if he's doing it against somebody like a Logan Paul or somebody else who's kind of a celebrity who's not a full-time MMA fighter, right? Something as a draw to get people to buy pay-per-views, right? I think that's a potential. And at the same time, I think if you saw what Pat McAfee has been doing in WWE, what George Kittle did Saturday night at WWE, what Shaq used to do, what Dennis Rodman used to do, that these guys who are natural athletes and natural performers from UFC could come over to WWE and with a little bit of training have a good gimmick match, essentially, where it sells pay-per-views. So I don't think that's a bad thing, right? I don't think having a talent pool that is separate from your own, who specialize in this other thing, but it's close enough, is a bad thing. It's why a band can hire a jazz drummer to play drums, even though they're a rock band. It's close enough skill set that you can teach it. Canonus, you said I thought the main event was it was awesome except for the main event day 2. I think the problem with the main event in day 2 is that you need Roman Reigns to win clean. Even if he cheats to win, he has to win. And instead what you had happen was he didn't win, Cody lost. And Roman isn't the reason Cody lost. Jey Uso's little brother is the reason that Cody lost. That's who Solo is. He's Uso's little brother. It's and that's just an opinion. So Candace says, I can't see Roman Reigns anymore. Cody should have won, in my opinion. That's a decision there. But the reality of that situation is this. Whether you want to leave the belt on Roman and have Cody chase it, because like a friend of mine pointed out earlier, the money is in the chase, right? They're going to sell more tickets to watch Cody try to beat Roman than they would ever sell to watch everyone else try to beat Cody. But if Roman can't win clean over Cody, then there's no chase anymore. You know who should have won. And that person just didn't. Alfie says, I know that fighters have crossed over. I meant because companies are merging, forcing it may happen. And that's kind of where we're getting to over here in my notes. We're going to get to that. X says, wasn't it bad enough when WWE, WCW merged? No. They're two people doing the same thing, right? I don't think that was a problem. I think it's about a video catalog back then, man. It's about having the best talent. And I think that was a great thing. Canonist, I don't think that's true either. And I get why they let Roman win, because if they sell WWE and they ain't sure if Cody would be as popular as Roman, no. I don't think that has anything to do with it. I think they're working a story. I think selling WWE is a separate thing. Wouldn't shock me if I'm wrong, but I think it's a separate thing. Okay. So to get back to kind of what we were talking about, right? We had the WrestleMania, and then this news comes out. And my first thought was, this is great. My first thought was, this is fantastic. But then I got to thinking about the other times I've seen a big company like Endeavor buy a little company. And WWE is not little, but WWE was independent in the sense that it was family owned. There was nobody higher than Vince McMahon in terms of WWE structure. So if Vince wanted something, he owned the company. He got to make his statement known. That's why Omos was in WrestleMania. You can't tell me that Omos earned a match yesterday. He didn't. Vince McMahon likes giants. They've proved him wrong many times. But for every Big Show or Mark Henry, you have El Gigante and Omos. And because of that, WWE had something going for it. A clear clarion vision that cared more about the on-air product than the money. And don't get me started on Nick Khan and some of the decisions WWE has made because of the money. But you have this without the money kind of mentality, right? It isn't about that. It's about the on-air product. So I got to thinking about this thing. And Endeavor hasn't really messed with UFC too much. They have, but not a ton. Bronze Age, what's up? What's up, dude? We need to have a conversation, you and I, in the next few days. Remind me to make Nick make that happen. So WWE merging with UFC has a lot of potential for greatness, but it has a lot of potential for failure. And I want to talk to you guys because I said at the top of the show, the grass is almost never greener. I want to talk to you guys about some of the time where the grass certainly hasn't, and some of the times where the grass certainly has. So we're going to take our first commercial break. But before we do that, I want to tell you guys, we have been doing some work here on the experience to kind of change the way some of the shows look. And if you like it, let us know in the comments. Say, hey, I like the new look, that kind of stuff. This show hasn't done it yet. I may do it after the break just to give you a little taste of how this show is going to look different in the near future. But in doing that, we've kind of got with our shows and changed some things up. And one of those changes is that starting Sunday, this coming Sunday, Easter Sunday, Sunday the 9th at 8:30, Country Roads Comics is back on the experience on Sunday nights starting at 8:30. But here's what's great about it. We start at 8:30 and we go till upside down ? We're going to go until you guys don't want us on the air anymore, and then we're going to stop. If that's 1 a.m., 2 a.m., 3 a.m., we're going. It's going to be exciting because it's all going to be dictated by you, the viewers, in terms of how long we go, what books we sell, and how much those books sell for. So it's going to be a super fun time. I'm super stressed out about it, but I want to make sure everybody shows up for that show. That's Sunday night at 8:30 Eastern. So if you live other places, just, tell me and I will do the math for you. But 8:30 Eastern here on the experience. No, not a subathon. Just as long as people are still in the comments interacting, watching, buying stuff, we're going to keep going. Now, we're not going to go all night. I mean, that Chris has got to work on Monday, and so do I. But we're going to go as long as y'all want us to. It's going to be a good time. The Sunday Super Mega Sale, starting this coming Sunday here on The Experience. We're going to take our first break right now. We're going to come back and we're going to break down some of these ideas about how the grass isn't greener or might be greener in some of those ideas right after this.
There's something for every imagination at your local comic shop. Visit comicshoplocator.com to find a store near you.
Sorry, everybody, I was taking a drink. But I want to remind you of another thing. Tuesday nights, me, Dan, and Jay in stores this week, where we talk about new books that are in stores this week. This week's list of books: Mosley #3, Star Trek Deep Space Nine, The Dogs of War #1, Sonic the Hedgehog 50th Anniversary Special. We're skipping that book because it's not out until May. Disney Villains, Scar #1 from Dynamite, Hairball #1 from Dark Horse, The Witcher, Ballad of Two Wolves #4, Crochet in Hell #4, and Where Monsters Lie. Tune in tomorrow, 6 o'clock Eastern, for that show. You know how when you go to Comic-Con, after Comic-Con, you go to the hotel bar, and there's a whole bunch of people playing music and dancing, and you've got Pikachu and Lara Croft Tomb Raider doing the cha-cha slide just down from Deadpool and Batman and Wonder Woman? That's every Saturday night over on the Experience Twitch channel. Join Taji Beats for the EXP Dance Party, exclusively on Twitch, twitch.tv/the_EXP. What if Hans Gruber from Die Hard had to battle the Joker from Batman the Animated Series in a dance battle? Or who would win in a race between Baby from Baby Driver and Snidely Whiplash? If Austin Powers and Shrek found themselves in a hot dog eating contest, who would emerge victorious? These are the questions we talk about on Nerd Killer Warfare. Debate the most absurd questions you've ever heard in popular culture. Register now by scanning the QR code or visiting bit.ly/EXP casting. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Hot Takes. I am producer Kyle. Told you I'd show you what I was working on. So, we were talking about when a big company takes over a smaller company, or not even necessarily a smaller company, an independent company. And why sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad. So back in 2018, a company called DMG Entertainment bought Valiant Comics. Exiled a bunch of the people who had been running Valiant, kind of took over, and they did some really cool things, right? Like they shepherded some movies across the line. They got Sony Pictures involved. They've done some really good things for Valiant, but when you look at Valiant now, the company is a shell of what it used to be. The creativity isn't the same as it used to be. The books are still incredibly good, incredibly high quality. But it's not the same. And to that end, I don't know that it was a good idea. Now, here's where this gets really interesting and kind of nebulous for me, right? Does a world exist where Valiant doesn't exist if not for DMG? Yes. Does a world exist where Valiant is as strong as it once was without DMG? Yes. So you can only go based on what's happened. And so when we think about a bigger company as we talk about a bigger company picking up an indie or buying an indie or absorbing an indie or merging with an indie or a smaller company, obviously the second part of that is always an option, right? Things could get better, things could get worse. I mentioned earlier when Disney bought the rights to Star Wars. And I mentioned how the comics are so much better. The comics are great. Not that the Dark Horse comics weren't great, but the comics are great now. And they have been for a while. But the movies have not been as good. Because the thing that made those movies great was George Lucas. And if Disney's overseeing them, George Lucas isn't. So you have the negative side effect, right? Of Disney takes over Star Wars. Now George Lucas isn't telling the Star Wars story. You lose the one clarion voice. You lose the one voice that's saying, this is what we believe. This is what we want. This is what we're doing. For the longest time, that person's been a guy named Ike Perlmutter at Marvel. Chairman of the board. And he's been the guy who a lot of people believe has been keeping Disney at bay. He's been the one who's keeping Disney from shutting down Marvel, from changing Marvel irreparably. He's been the one standing in the firing line. And last week, Marvel let him go. And the story that news publications ran was that Disney has absorbed Marvel. Disney lets go Ike Perlmutter and absorbs Marvel. Well, let's start with, first of all, that's not exactly what happened. It's a simplification. But you're right. There is some change. Ship wants us to bring on board Timothy Zahn. I think you mean Timothy Zahn. Different people. Alfie says, I'm not a Star Wars fan, really. I do enjoy comics coming out, though. The movies, they're okay. And Ship, I'm going to give you trouble if you can't spell Zahn. We're too good of friends for me to let that one go, buddy. Bronze Age Nerds, I think Rogue One was the best Star Wars movie since Return of the Jedi. It's been rough since then. True. But here's my premise. Here's my point. Ship, Alfie's on YouTube. She says, hey. There's a world that existed. Bronze Age Nerds, we're about the same age, a few years different. But for a large portion of our life, we lived in a world where Star Wars wasn't a thing. The original 3 had come out. There were some books being published. There might be some comics, but there were no Star Wars movies. Marvel buys Star Wars. Disney buys Marvel. All of this stuff happened. And now we live in a world where we get about as much Star Wars as we can handle. Even if it's not great. Oh, too much. But even if it's not great, we exist in a world where Star Wars exists. So based on the premise that I've been portraying in this show, the grass isn't always greener. Star Wars was better when Disney kept its hands out of it. Candace says she would love the Thrawn trilogy being filmed. That's not to say we won't get it. We have people who are now at the helm of Star Wars who I trust more than I trusted the previous group. I think Jon Favreau and Dave Filoni are great. And so I trust them with Star Wars. So we're going to see what happens, right? But if not for Marvel coming along and Disney coming along and screwing up Star Wars, there's a better than even chance we exist in a world with no new Star Wars. Where we just have to be those people who like that movie that came out 40 years ago. I don't want to live in a world where there's not new Star Wars. And so the grass isn't always greener because the movies aren't as good, but we get to keep the movies. We get good comics coming out. Whereas what would have happened when Dark Horse decides they don't want to deal with Star Wars anymore? Right? If Marvel hadn't stepped in, what would have happened? We may have had to go through a time where there were not even Star Wars comics. So we would have been totally relying on Timothy Zahn. There's an H in their ship, no E. Anyway, I'm going to keep going back to that, buddy. But we would have lived in a world where there was no Star Wars. Except for Timothy Zahn. And maybe some audiobooks. That's not a lot of Star Wars. DC gets acquired by Warner Brothers a few years ago. Things started to get a little weird. It's not quite the same DC as it was before. Not bad, but it's not the same. And then Warner Brothers merges with HBO and all this other kind of stuff. And everything gets a little weirder. And the movies become less good because, like, after Superman 3, DC hasn't made a good movie. Except for, like, Shazam. Shazam 2. Really. The Nolan Batmans were okay, but, like, they weren't really crushing it. And so, like, there's this idea of what would have happened if that had never happened. Would DC have gone like Marvel was in the 90s, where they're selling off their IP to Sony so that they could stay afloat? Maybe. Would I rather have Disney or DC IP under the DC header? Disagree, Alfie. Batman with Robert Pattinson was only okay. He was a fine Batman. He was a terrible Bruce Wayne. I don't need hair curtains Bruce Wayne. Anyway. There's a world that exists where DC becomes insolvent and goes away. And now who's shepherding Batman and Superman and Wonder Woman and Harley Quinn and all these characters? So the merger was good, even if not all of the outcomes were great. I said I was going to open the phone lines and I completely forgot to. So I'm going to open the phone lines. Do you have an example of a time where you thought, gee, this is going to be great and it wound up being bad? Or conversely, a time when you thought something was going to be bad and it wound up being great? I want you to tell me what those are. You can call in by dialing 567-318-6507. You can be on the air. 567-318-6507. Or you can put it in the comments and I'll call it out. Alfie said earlier, it's kind of a big company takes over and makes the thing and introduces new people to the universe, new nerds. Sure. But you also can't lose nerds and keep growing. It's an interesting thing, and this is something that I didn't think I was going to talk about, but I will because it's interesting to me. One of the things that I do for the experience as my job as executive producer is to look at our numbers. And one of the stats that YouTube gives us, Facebook doesn't because Facebook doesn't give us good stats, is something called audience retention. And it's how many people show up at the beginning of your show and stay to the end. And it gives you a chart, a line chart, where you could see where more people tuned in and more people left. And more people tuned in and more people left. And our goal at all times is to find a number and have a flat line. So if one person leaves, one new person joins. You're not growing. You're just staying the same. And the reason we're doing that is because it's 9:30 right now, Eastern Standard Time, 9:35. If there's a sitcom on you want to watch, or you're watching Monday Night Raw, you might come into my show for a minute and then go back to doing that. But if it's a 1-to-1 ratio, my viewer retention stays the same. That's not growth, that's survival. What you really want is for every one person that goes away, 2 people to join. For every one person that goes away, 3 people join. For every one person that goes away, 4 people join. That's growth. And so what happens is these big companies come in and get involved with Marvel or DC or Valiant or WWE or Clear Channel Media when I worked there or whatever. And these big companies are like, okay, great. You're doing good. Here's some money, but here's what we want for our money. And they start changing things. Not always, but sometimes. And then you start to see that slough off. People who, it's not the same, I'm out. People who walk away from something because it's not what they expect it to be. And you can see that when you look at The Mandalorian this season. I have not yet watched a second of The Mandalorian. None. Mandalorian's viewership is down 50% from the last season. Now, last season happened during a pandemic. People weren't going out. There's a lot of factors to that. But what that's showing is that for every new person who's come to The Mandalorian, they've lost 2. For every new person watching The Mandalorian right now, they've lost 2. Oh, Mythical helped out Smosh. I feel like that was better, to be honest. Yes, sometimes it does, right? And here's the thing that's important about this, right? Mythical helped out Smosh. Mythical wasn't necessarily bigger or better. It was just different. It was an independent helping an independent. It's the same way of me talking to Bronze Age Nerd about the stuff he does is going to help us, and him talking to us about the things we do might help him. We're 2 independent people who are doing similar things, who are just trying to rise the tides of all ships. A rising tide raises all ships, so why not everyone work together, right? That's what happened with Mythical and Smosh. So what we're talking about here is this idea of corporate ownership. Ship, have you had a few, buddy? Because some of these comments make no sense. This idea of corporate ownership and the idea of changing things to make them more profitable. Profit doesn't always mean better. It means profit. Profit doesn't always mean that you've saved the thing that made it great, right? The thing that made Star Wars great was George Lucas and his vision. The thing that made Marvel great was Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and John Buscema and John Romita and those guys. The thing that made DC great were Siegel and Schuster and George Perez and Marv Wolfman and Carmine Infantino and Neil Adams, right? And Frank Miller, and these guys are what made it great. And these corporate companies come along and say, we love what you're doing. Now do it in a way that'll make more money. And like the band I referenced earlier, they start changing the words. They start doing things that make it more broad, more appealing, and it doesn't necessarily make it better. I said earlier, excuse me. I said earlier, this whole show started with me wanting to talk about WWE. I've been a WWE fan for as long as I can remember. I remember growing up watching Saturday morning, watching wrestling on Sunday morning, reruns of Saturday Night's Main Event. I remember watching Raw and SmackDown with my uncle. I remember watching when I understood the difference between WWE and WCW. I remember being a WCW fan. And then I remember when Vince bought them and all of this and all of these things. And I've come and gone from wrestling fandom over the years, but I've always been a wrestling fan. I've always been a wrestling fan. And wrestling is going to change. And it has changed over the last number of years. And not necessarily for the worse or for the better. It just has changed. And so as I'm thinking about what this means with WWE making this change, and I'm thinking about what it means as Disney is taking more control of Marvel, think about what it means that Discovery might try and sell off part of DC. Think about what it means for small companies, Aftershock, Valiant, SourcePoint Press, to be looked at by these bigger companies that have a financial interest in what they're doing, but not a creative interest. And it makes me worried. It makes me scared. Because I don't want to see these things that are right and good go away. Alfie says, not really the same, but didn't the producers of The Witcher get annoyed because Cavill wanted to stay true to the source? I mean, that is corporate kind of. I think the bigger problem that the producers of The Witcher had was that Cavill was a pain in their butt. Henry Cavill leaving The Witcher is probably the best thing for The Witcher. Ship says, but this is the same with everything that embodies the American dream. Passion is only held within companies that are owned by the creator that started said company and experienced all the ups and downs. Without passion, so much is lost. We're gonna talk about that when we come back from the break, Ship. We're gonna take our next commercial break here in a minute. Last call for phone calls, 567-318-6507, 567-318-6507 to talk about this. There are instances where good things have come from this. Ryan Reynolds and Rob McElhenney buying AFC Wrexham, right? In England. Like, that's a big deal. In Wales, I should say. That's a big company, big money coming in and buying this little independent thing, making it better. Now, granted, it's new. We'll see what happens. There are things that would certainly have failed if it weren't for big corporations coming in and saving them. Not going to say that doesn't happen, right? There's software that's available now for every person that only exists because Apple bought the software and changed it. So I don't want you to think that this is all a bad thing. One of my favorite examples. A friend of mine was a pretty well-known independent music DJ, in that he had a very widely listened to show that he basically ran out of his house and broadcast on YouTube and on Twitch. And Apple Music came along and bought the show. So much stronger now because he has the power of the big company behind him. He can book bigger guests. He can get more music in the library. He can do things with the power of Apple behind him that he couldn't do when it was him in his garage. So there's something to that. But I want to talk when we come back about this idea of independence, of being an indie. And what that means, and why is Kyle ranting for 44 and a half minutes about WWE and all this kind of stuff, and how does it relate to comics? It's a good question. I know you've been thinking it, Alfie. We'll be right back after these messages from some people doing some things. Did you know that every experience show, including some exclusive content, streams on Twitch? Check it out, twitch.tv/the_EXP. Or just scan that QR code. Go follow the experience on TikTok at @the_EXP1. Or scan the QR code on the screen. Our TikTok is like everywhere else we are, except you only have to deal with us for a minute. Seems like a win-win to me.
You just finished the last episode of your favorite new show, and you just have to talk about it. But all your friends are ghosting you because of that incident last week at the buffet. Oh, you know the one. What you did to that chowder. Ugh. Keeps me up at night. So what do? Join writer Dan Wickline as he breaks down all your favorite pop culture media. Whether it's a review of the latest nerdy TV show or a dive back into the history of your favorite comic characters, Dan's ready to discuss all the hottest topics live. Join the conversation as Dan live streams Tuesday through Thursday at 5 Eastern, 2 Pacific on Twitch, Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook. The Dan Wickline Show, on The Experience, Comic Culture and Sales.
What's up, the internet? Welcome back. This is Hot Takes. I am producer Kyle. So we've been talking about this idea of, it started with the WWE merger with the UFC and got me talking about Marvel merging with Disney and DC with Discovery and some of these other things. And I guess the answer to the question, there's two questions still outstanding. Why do I think this is bad, even though it might seem good at the outset? And what can we do? What's the point? Why am I ranting about this tonight? What makes these things great is the way that they existed, not what they are, not what they made, not how they made it, the way they existed. Driven by the art and the creatives, driven by the passion of the people making them. When oversight becomes a part of these decisions, you have to make financial decisions, not creative decisions. Now, all of a sudden, the best story and the best art become less important than the most affordable story and the most affordable art, or the story that will sell the most copies with the art that will sell the story the best. So you wind up in this sort of equivocating, this sort of trying to find a middle ground, this sort of moderation. Whereas in previous incarnations, these companies didn't have to do that. If WWE wanted Roman Reigns to retain the belt at WrestleMania, all that had to happen was Vince McMahon had to say, Roman Reigns is keeping the belt at WrestleMania. Now they have to test the story. They have to say, okay, if Roman Reigns keeps the belt at WrestleMania, how many pay-per-view buys will that get us for Backlash? How many t-shirts will that sell us? How many butts will that put in seats? It's a reference to my friend Tony Schiavone, by the way. How many butts will that put in seats at house shows? How much merch will it sell? Will it sell more Cody Rhodes merch? Will it sell more Roman Reigns merch? What will it do financially? Marvel can never be what it was under Stan Lee. Again. Because Stan's not here to do it. But because the die has been cast so far down the line that they can't go back to that. They can never go back. They've gone too far. Star Wars can never be what it was when it was just under George Lucas. Too much has changed. Too many ingredients are in the pot to take it back to that very pure state. DC can never be what it was under Carmine Infantino. Too much politics. Too many people involved in the storytelling. And WWE can never go back to what it was when Vince McMahon bought it from his father and what he had built it to before AEW existed, for sure. But now that it's being merged with this other company, it can never go back to that pure thing that I remember watching as a kid growing up. So what's my point? And I wrote one sentence. Like, I wrote 3 pages of notes for this show. I wrote one sentence to sum up my point. Indie matters. Today on Miss Jen's Talking Shop show, we had Cullen Bunn, Blackie Shepherd, and Ted Sikora. 3 guys who, with the exception of Cullen Bunn, are as independent as they come. Right? Now, that's not to say that Cullen Bunn isn't independent, but Cullen Bunn works for everybody. Cullen Bunn's a successful independent. And so is Blackie Shepherd. He's working for Dynamite. Like, don't miss that. That's a huge swing. It's a huge get. Ted is very successful with Hero Tomorrow Comics. Launched his Kickstarter a few days ago and is already like 85% funded. These guys are out there doing it themselves. So why does that matter? This past weekend, where there were a bunch of conventions, tons. Space Cadets alone was at 3. But at C2, I was talking to people who were at C2E2. And one of the comments I got from somebody was about the line that was lined up for these big Marvel creators and for the Marvel booth. And for the booths of the guys who are there representing these big corporations and conglomerates. And how a company like Fair Square Comics can have their best show ever and barely break even. An independent company doesn't get a second look. An independent creator doesn't get the same second look that the big creators do because, well, people just go. Indie matters. It matters more, I would argue, than the big companies. Because while the big companies may buoy the industry, the independent creators are the ones who will be there in the end when it all crumbles to the ground. You can look at it in any industry when you see an industry fail. The people who make it out, or the people who make it the longest, are the people who are out there doing it in their own way, by themselves, just hunkered down and creating. Hunkered down and doing the job. Not reliant on these big companies. Not reliant on corporate oversight. Not listening to it because there's no one to tell them. Independent comic book creators, independent creators of any kind matter. And at the end of the day, when you see a story like WWE being sold, or Disney letting go of Ike Perlmutter and absorbing Marvel, or you hear that, well, Discovery might be checking their options as it relates to DC, always remember that there are a ton of people out there making great comics that couldn't give a crap about any of that. Because they're making their comics. They've got displays at conventions. And I think I've said this probably 2 or 3 times, but I'm going to say it as my closing remark here. When you walk through the hall of a convention, stop. Buy a book. From somebody you would never stop and buy a book from. Something that doesn't look wildly interesting to you, but the person who's making it looks interesting. Or the book looks interesting, even if the person who's making it maybe doesn't look like someone you want to talk to. Stop and have a conversation. Stop and buy a book. Tom Hutchison was on the show a few weeks ago. You know, Big Dog Inc. is one of those people that you stop and buy a book. Fabrice from Fair Square. Stop and buy a book. They've got, Fair Square has this great book, Black Box, that is one of my favorite comics I've read in the last year. I don't know how to sell that book to people other than to tell them to stop and hear the pitch from him. Stop at his booth. Have a conversation. And I'll leave you with this. When I bought Walking Dead #1, Robert Kirkman was a guy with a zombie book sitting at the end of Artist Alley at New York Comic Con. When I bought Destiny New York, which we just learned today has been optioned and is being produced by Sony with Tegan and Sarah, Pat Shand was somebody that my friend Raven told me I should check out. These are the people who are making the industry spin these days. These are the guys who are driving the bus. If I hadn't stopped back then, I never would have known what I was getting myself into when I decided to watch The Walking Dead or when I decided to go see this movie. If I had never stopped and talked to those guys, I would never have known what was cutting edge in comics. I would never have known where the best work was being done. Independent matters. Don't stop with the guys who have the biggest logos on their banners or the covers of books that you recognize. Stop with the guys who have stuff you don't recognize. Stop with Henri. Stop with Pat. Stop with Ted. Stop with Cullen. Support your creators. Support the people who you don't know. And you wouldn't know if you didn't stop. Because I guarantee you something that will never be said about an independent creator. It was way better. It was way better before so-and-so bought them. It was way better before Discovery told them what to do. Never going to say that about an independent creator. Comics are for everyone. I love you all. I'll see you next week. Join the party. Head over to our Linktree to find all the links for everywhere the experience is all the time.